Good afternoon, Year 6, and welcome to our final recorded lesson of this lockdown. We're really looking forward to having you back with us on Monday. So we're going to carry on with our science topic today, which is about evolution. And we're having a look at adaptations that animals have to survive in extreme environments. So what have we learned so far? I'd like you to pause the video now and see if you can use one of these sentence starters to help you think about what you've learned so far in this topic. Okay, so hopefully you've written maybe an example of a definition of something like adaptation or variation. You might want to tell me about a scientist that you've learned about in this topic, or a particular animal or living thing that you've researched. So, because we're looking at adaptations today, we're going to recap what we've learned so far. So far we know that adaptations can occur due to the environment or inheritance. We did that last lesson. We also know that it can improve an animal's chance of survival, which sometimes results in a new species evolving after hundreds or thousands of years because they adapt so much that they actually become a different species altogether. But actually, last lesson we found out that before that happens, it creates variation between animals of the same species. So, therefore, adaptations make it possible for lots of living things to survive on Earth, and everything is different. They're all unique. Some species have adapted to live in the most extreme environments that we have on our planet. So can you think of any examples where there are extreme conditions? And there's a couple of pictures below to help you get you started. So pause the video now, see if you can have a think of some extreme environments. So you might have come up with some environments that are extreme because they are really, really cold. You might have come up with some that are extreme because they're really, really hot. So the two clues I gave you were cartoons, but if we move these pictures, we can see what these environments really look like. So this is an example of the Arctic that we've looked at in geography as well, which is in the northern hemisphere. So there's lots of water, lots of ice, lots of snow, and big icebergs where it's a big clump together. And if we move this one, my example was of the desert. So already we can see that these are really different. This one doesn't have any water at all, and it looks really dry and sandy. So what we are going to do today is explain how animals and some other living things like plants are adapted to their environment. And your success criteria is to know how the animals adapted, to be able to give us some reasons as to why they've adapted in that way, and explain why that's useful for the environment that they're living in. So pause the video now and have a look at the 5 animals that are around my star. What I'd like you to do as we go through the lesson is for each one, write down 3 things, 3 adaptations that each one has as I tell you about them. And then at the end, you can test yourself on a quiz and in your work. So on your piece of paper that you might have at home, we've got camels, seals, lily pads. I'm not going to tell you what this bird's called at the moment, but we've got a type of bird and a polar bear. So, first question to get us started. If you visited the Arctic, which is in the northern hemisphere, so at the top of our world map, how would you survive? What things would you need? What might be useful? If you had an adaptation, what might we want it to be? So just pause the video, see if you can write down a few things that might be helpful for you to survive if you lived in the Arctic or visited it. Okay, so some of the things you might have come up with include clothing for warmth, to keep us warm. So clothing would be an example. We might be able to eat certain foods that keep us warm. So maybe we need to eat more in order to give us that energy that we're losing through trying to keep our bodies warm. It might be that we have longer hair, because that traps air and keeps our skin nice and warm. It means less heat can be lost from our skin, which is something that we looked in one of our other science topics before when we were doing circulation. Is there anything else that you might need? So, polar bears are an example of an animal that live in the Arctic. They're able to survive there because of the adaptations they have. So there's some pictures on my screen at the moment. What adaptations have they got that helps them to survive? So it could be due to their environment, it could be due to what they've inherited. So this picture here is of a polar bear that's looking at the water. So one of the things that I thought of was that they've learned to hunt on land and in water. It's one of the things they're really good at. This second picture at the top shows that polar bears can stand on their hind legs, which is a word that we've come across. So this word hind is a word we've come across in our Wolf for the book when we've been talking about the bear that stands on its hind legs to make itself really tall. It makes it quite frightening. And we also talked about the wolf having hind legs as well. It just means its back legs. So that could be to fight or fend off predators. It might be to look for something. This picture down here shows a cub and it looks really snuggled up in its mum's legs. So one of the adaptations they have is that they've got lots of fur, but they're also able to use this to keep their young or their cubs warm, which is really important because it helps them to survive. And it's quite protective as well. If you imagine being in there, you probably feel quite safe. Next one's quite an obvious one. What have polar bears adapted to be able to do? They can swim, which means they can hunt, they can move to places, but also I can imagine that the water in the Arctic would be really, really cold. So it's quite clever that these polar bears are able to survive when they're swimming at what could be quite a long distance in the icy water. And there's lots of other animals in there. So whales, for example, that might also be hunting as well. And then the last one is a bit of a trickier one that you might not have seen before, which is a polar bear's den. And they often have different sections in them. So the bit that's like the opening is where the adult polar bears might be if they've got young. And then further back, they often have little compartments in them, a bit like a separate room where they keep their young. So it's to protect themselves. And also, if you've ever seen an igloo, or built one maybe yourself when it snowed, they are used to keep things warm, because actually the compact ice and being underneath that in quite a small space keeps things warm as well. So here is a picture of a polar bear with lots of adaptations on it. Some of them we've talked about, others we haven't. So they've got large furry feet, and that's because they walk on ice and snow, so it keeps them warm. And the big paws allow the polar bear to swim easily in the water surrounding its habitat. So that's how it's adapted to be able to swim in those cold waters. It's got really long claws, which allow it to tear apart its prey and be able to eat it. And it's got small rounded ears. So small ears minimize the amount of water that enters the ear, and it also keeps them warm. It stops lots of heat being lost through their heads. They've got a muscle hump over their shoulders for catching large prey. So it means that they're really muscly and really strong in those front legs so that they can get the prey. And they've got hollow fur that allows a polar bear to float in water when it's swimming. And its hollow fur allows a polar bear to float in water when it's swimming. And it also insulates it, so that keeps it really nice and warm as well. So, do you think polar bears are still having to adapt, and quite rapidly, to their environment at the moment? So this is what that environment now looks like. Do you think the polar bear looks different, and how might it be having to adapt now and why. So pause the video, see if you can figure out if it's still adapting. So this area of the Arctic seems to have a lot less ice at the moment. It looks a little bit warmer to me. So people believe that the climate is changing and it's making the Arctic hotter and the ice is melting. So there's not as bigger areas for polar bears to hunt from, and also to have a rest from all of the swimming. This polar bear looks very different. So its fur is a little bit darker, but we've seen that on some of the other photos, which is because as the Arctic changes over the year, sometimes there are grassy areas and it needs to blend in, but it looks different to the one on the iceberg. And I think that's because it looks a lot thinner. And what polar bears are having to do is scavenge for food in things like bin bags from what humans have eaten. So they're not hunting in the way that they would normally, because other animals can't survive as well as they did before in the habitat because of how it's changed. So they're having to adapt to be able to survive still. So do you think the adaptations that a polar bear has would help it to survive in a rainforest? And can you explain why you think what you think? So pause the video. Do you think it would be able to live in a rainforest? So my answer to that would be no, I don't think a polar bear would be able to live there. And I think that because the rainforest is quite hot and humid, and it's not what a polar bear's adapted to live in. It's got features that wouldn't really help it there, and it would probably not be able to survive in the heat. So my sentence would be a polar bear wouldn't be able to survive because its adaptations are not for humid or hot, humid weather. So I've used my knowledge of what rainforests are like and tried to think about why a polar bear might not be able to survive there. You might want to choose one of its adaptations that we've discussed and hopefully be making notes of them to help you in the quiz later on. So you might want to be able to pick one of those and say, actually, if it has small ears which allow it to not lose heat very well, when you put it in a hot environment, that wouldn't be very good because, and then finish the sentence off. So next question for you. If you visited the desert, which was the second extreme environment that we were looking at, how would you survive there? So pause the video and see if you can come up with lots of ideas that would help you survive in a desert. What would you need? Maybe what sorts of clothing would you have with you? What would you take? So pause the video, have a think about what you would need. Now let's have a look at what animals live there then. So here are some pictures of things that have adapted to that to survive in the desert. So this is an image of the desert. It's quite high up in the desert at the moment, and we've got some grassy sorts of plants. We've got some taller ones that have got sort of like pointy leaves, and we've also got cactuses or cacti. We've got camels that we're probably all familiar with. Another image of the grassy things, and then we've got 3 different animals. And I've put, what do these 3 animals have in common? So this is number 1. We've got a desert fox. We've got number 2, a desert sort of mouse. And number 3, a desert hare. What adaptations do they have that are similar? So see if you can spot the one that they've all got in common. And well done if you said that they've all got extra large ears. So I've just told you that a polar bear has small ears because it helps it keep heat in. Why do you think these ones have big ears, the opposite? It's to keep heat out, you're right. So having big ears means that there's a lot of space there for the heat to come out of their bodies. It helps keep them cool. So our first animal that we're going to have a look at is a camel. So camels are herbivores. They eat plants. So they eat those desert plants like the grasses, maybe some herbs and a few leaves. So how have they been able to survive in that environment then? Because there's not many plants there that they can get. So camels have adaptations that let them live successfully in those hot and dry conditions. There's often winds that blow sand all around. So camels have long eyelashes, which is like in this photo in the big box here. And it stops the sand being blown into their eyes. It keeps their eyes nice and moist and doesn't allow it to get blocked. And they have nostrils that open and close, which also allows them to lose heat. So it also means that they can't get sand up their nose as well. So why is a camel a perfect animal then for living in the desert? So if you imagine living in this extreme heat and it's hot in the day and very cold actually at night, there's lots of sand dunes, but there's no water for miles. It's actually quite hard work. So what a camel does is, because the water's rare, they have a hump on their back and they store huge amounts of water in them. So that hump on the camel's back, let's have a look, let's go back to that photo. That looks like this. Stores lots of water for when they need it. It's the same there. And it means that they can sustain walking over long distances without needing a drink because they've got the water in their hump. So they can actually go 30 days without water. That's an interesting fact for you. And then we've got sinking in the sand. So walking on sand can give you like a sinking feeling. So if you've ever been on the beach and you've tried to run really fast, it's a lot harder than if you try running on tarmac or something like our playground, because you feel like you're sinking, it's constantly moving. And it can be really, really tiring, but the camels have adapted their feet so that they're good at it. So their feet spread out over the sand and it gives them a larger surface area. So it basically covers a larger area on the sand, and it means that they don't sink when they're walking. So they get less tired than we would do if we were on there. So another adaptation they've got is that they've also adapted to be able to live in these sandstorms or like windy conditions where the sand's there. So they need their eyesight and they want to protect it. So to stop sand getting in their eyes, they've developed the long eyelashes, which block the tiny sand grains from damaging their eyes. So actually, they've got lots and lots of things that have helped them to adapt in that environment. So I've picked one of the other living things from the desert, a cactus, and I've got a question for you. Do you think it would be able to live in a swamp, and why? So think about the conditions it lives in now and how we've just described the desert, and then think about the conditions in a swamp and use this picture down here to help you. So pause the video, see if you can come up with an answer. So my answer would be, again, I don't think they'd be very adapted to living in a swamp. If you put a cactus out, it probably wouldn't survive. So I'm going to say no, because a swamp has very wet conditions. It's quite extreme actually though. It's quite muddy. So very wet and muddy conditions. Oops. Whereas the desert has very, how did you describe it? Hot and dry. So it's sort of the opposite conditions. Well done. So this is the bird that I didn't tell you the name of to start with. It's called a godwit, and they actually survive. We do get them in the UK. We also get them in Iceland, which is a country that we've looked at a few times now, and they can often go to the Arctic as well. So sometimes they have different colours depending on where they are or what time of year it is. But we're going to have a look at this sort, and then we've got a little video to show you what they actually look like to answer the question, why do those adaptations help them to survive? So they are large wading birds. So that word wading means that they actually can walk through water that's actually quite deep. It's coming quite high up on their legs. So you might want to start thinking about what sort of feet is a bird that goes in water going to have. Think about other birds that we know that are in water. In summer, they have bright orangey brown chests and bellies, but in winter, they're more greyish brown, so that they change colour depending on what their environment is like. But their most distinctive feature, the thing that stands out the most, are their long beaks and legs and the black and white stripes on their wings. So this one's got its wings sort of tucked away at the moment, but it does have black and white stripes on it, or darker stripes. It's got its long beak here, and it's also got really long legs. So let's have a look at our video, and then can you tell me, after watching this, why those things help it to survive in the environment it lives in? So that's them wading in the water, but where are they now? So think about what that beak might help them to do. And what does their colour allow them to do as well? So let's have a look to see if we can answer that question. Why do these adaptations help them to survive? What's that beak really good for? What are their long legs good for? So their long beaks help them to hunt worms, snails, insects, beetles, and grasshoppers, and they can also eat plants. So they're able to go down in that long grass or even in the water to try and find out things like worms. And they live in estuaries, which are like big parts of rivers that then lead into the sea, and coastal lagoons, but they also visit some wetlands and marshes. So the thing that they've adapted the most to is living in wet environments. So they've got these long legs, so no matter where they are, they can walk in the water and try and find food. And I imagine that they've got webbed feet to help them do that. So another plant that we're going to have a look at to see how it's adapted to the environment it lives in is a lily pad. So have a look at this picture. What things could you use from what the picture shows? So this is like our inference that we've practiced in reading. What can you see that might be an adaptation that allows it to survive or do what it's doing? So pause the video, see if you can come up with a few things and write them in a sentence. So one of the things you might have said is that they're round, but they're also quite large leaves. So I've written they have big leaves that help them to float on the surface of the water. This also allows them to get lots of sunlight, and we know that plants need sunlight and water and nutrients to help them grow. So they've got one of the things that they need that's really important for them to grow. The top of the leaf is coated with a cuticle, so it's like a waxy layer, and it keeps it as dry as possible. So it's a bit like if you imagine doing art with a wax crayon, if you get water on there, it just sits on the top, right? It won't actually sink into your drawing, it just sits on the top. So this waxy layer means that it can keep quite dry on the top as well. But the underneath has thorns even to protect it from predators. So the underneath of this lily pad has thorns on it, and it stops things like fish or other animals that might want to eat it from doing that. So next animal that we're going to look at to see how it's adapted to its environment. So you might be able to use what you know about where seals live. You might be able to use its colour or maybe some of its features to help you think about this one. So pause it, see if you can come up with any from the picture, and then we'll go through it together. So some of the adaptations that this seal has. It has hind flippers, so it's got like a tail at the end, but it's actually separated. So it's a bit more like legs actually, which some people don't realise, to help it swim. And it's also got them at the front as well. It has thick but short fur, which helps to keep it really warm. And so does its blubber for isolation against cold waters, insulation even against cold waters. So it keeps it really, really warm. It's got thick skin. It's got a lighter coloured under part, so its sort of belly is lighter coloured, and that's probably to blend in with things like water when it's swimming. It has closable ears with no external ear flap. So if you see, it doesn't have like a normal ear like we would usually see on an animal. It's got a little hole here, which it can close. So that's really useful when it goes underwater because it stops water getting in its ears. And it's got really large eyes that contain a certain special type of cell that help it to see, probably underwater as well. It's got really sensitive whiskers so that it knows when predators are coming towards it, but it can also sense its prey that it wants to catch. And it's got closable nostrils like its ears, because that will help keep the water out. Its teeth are really, really pointy at the front. So if you've ever seen one open its mouth on a video, you'll know that it has really pointy teeth, and that'll help it catch its prey and also eat it. And it's got a really thick neck. So what we would like you to do today is write an information paragraph, really, rather than a text, about the adaptations a living thing has to help it survive in an extreme environment. So you can choose one of the 5 on this lesson that we've talked about, or the ones that we've talked about at the end, and challenge yourself to research. You could challenge yourself to research one of the ones that we've mentioned but not actually been through. So a cactus, or a desert fox, a desert hare, or a desert mouse. Or you could do one of the ones that lives in a cold environment, like the Arctic fox maybe, or penguins, because we haven't looked at the Antarctic yet, we've only looked at the Arctic. So there's some suggestions for you if you don't want to use some of the information that's on mine to write your paragraph. There is a planning grid to help you. So we'd like a little bit of an introduction about your animal. Introduce what the animal is and what adaptation it has. What does it look like? You could use a picture to help you, like I did. And then we'd like you to try and give 3 reasons for how your animal is adapted. So it might be, it has small ears because, and then tell us why that's important using your conjunctions, and why it helps it live in its environment. And then once you finish that, you've got a quiz to complete. See if you could remember the adaptations for each of the living things on this lesson without cheating. See how many points you can get from the notes that you've made. All right, so well done. And we look forward to seeing your work.